Right now, you're breathing without thinking about it, an automatic, continuous process your body handles roughly 20 times every single minute without requiring any conscious effort or attention whatsoever. Oxygen represents such a completely fundamental biological requirement that most people rarely stop to consider exactly how quickly its absence would actually become fatal, or exactly what's happening inside your body during that process. So, can humans actually survive without oxygen? And if so, for exactly how long and under exactly what specific circumstances? Let's dig into this properly because the answer involves some truly fascinating human physiology, some carefully documented medical research, and a few remarkable, well documented exceptions worth exploring specifically. Let's start with the basic physiological reason oxygen proves so completely essential in the first place, because understanding this underlying biological mechanism helps explain everything else worth exploring throughout this broader discussion. Your body's cells rely on oxygen to efficiently convert food into usable cellular energy through a process called cellular respiration. And your brain specifically depends on a continuous, uninterrupted supply of oxygen rich blood to maintain normal function, given how much energy your brain actually consumes relative to its physical size and how limited its capacity is for storing any kind of backup energy reserve it could otherwise rely on during any significant interruption in this continuous oxygen supply. This detail matters considerably for understanding why oxygen deprivation becomes dangerous so remarkably quickly compared to deprivation of most other basic biological necessities. Unlike food or water, where the body maintains meaningful reserves capable of sustaining basic function for days or even weeks in extreme circumstances, your body maintains only an extremely limited oxygen reserve, meaning any significant interruption in oxygen supply creates an almost immediate, urgent physiological crisis rather than the more gradual, extended decline associated with food or water deprivation specifically. Let's talk about exactly how quickly oxygen deprivation actually becomes dangerous and eventually fatal, because this represents an important, medically well documented timeline worth exploring specifically. Complete oxygen deprivation typically causes loss of consciousness within roughly 1 to 2 minutes, with irreversible brain damage generally beginning within approximately 4 to 6 minutes of complete oxygen deprivation, and death typically following within a similar general time frame absent successful medical intervention. This detail is worth sitting with directly because it illustrates just how remarkably narrow the actual survival window proves to be, considerably shorter than most people probably assume when they haven't specifically studied or considered this particular physiological reality in any real detail before. Let's talk about why brain tissue specifically proves so vulnerable to oxygen deprivation compared to other body tissues too, because this represents an important, biologically specific detail worth exploring in additional depth. Brain tissue has an unusually high metabolic rate and correspondingly high oxygen requirement relative to its physical size, while simultaneously possessing very limited capacity for anaerobic energy production, meaning it can't effectively generate meaningful cellular energy without oxygen the way certain other body tissues can manage, at least temporarily, during brief periods of oxygen deprivation. This specific biological vulnerability explains why brain damage represents the primary, most immediate concern during oxygen deprivation specifically, considerably more urgent and time-sensitive compared to the somewhat more gradual damage other body tissues and organs typically experience during a comparable period of oxygen deprivation. Let's talk about documented cases involving unusually extended survival without breathing too, because this represents a seriously fascinating, medically well-documented exception worth exploring specifically. Certain specific circumstances can meaningfully extend survival time during oxygen deprivation beyond the typical time frame already discussed extensively throughout this topic. Cold water immersion specifically has been documented producing remarkable, well-verified cases of survival. Following considerably extended periods without breathing, particularly in young children, connected to a specific physiological response researchers refer to as the mammalian dive reflex, which reduces heart rate and redirects blood flow, specifically towards the brain and heart during cold water submersion, while the significantly lowered body temperature simultaneously reduces overall cellular metabolic demand and, correspondingly, oxygen requirement throughout the body. This detail is worth appreciating specifically because it demonstrates that the typical oxygen deprivation timeline already discussed throughout this topic isn't some kind of completely fixed, universal biological constant applying identically under every possible circumstance. Under these particular circumstances, Cold water immersion combined with this specific physiological reflex response, documented survival cases have occurred following considerably longer periods without breathing compared to what would typically prove fatal under ordinary circumstances, offering really compelling, well-documented medical evidence regarding just how significantly specific physiological circumstances can meaningfully extend the body's actual practical tolerance for oxygen deprivation. Let's talk about freediving and trained breath-holding capability too, because this represents another interesting, directly relevant category worth exploring specifically. Elite trained freedivers, through extensive specific training and practice, have demonstrated remarkable voluntary breath-holding capability, with certain documented cases extending well beyond 10 minutes under carefully controlled, medically supervised conditions. This particular capability results from a combination of specific physiological adaptations developed through extensive training, including increased lung capacity and improved tolerance for elevated carbon dioxide levels, alongside psychological training specifically focused on managing the body's urgent, instinctive breathing reflex for a considerably extended period compared to what an untrained individual could typically manage. This detail is worth including because it illustrates an important distinction worth appreciating throughout this entire discussion. The specific oxygen deprivation timeline already discussed represents a general, typical pattern rather than an absolute, completely fixed biological limit applying identically to every single individual under every possible circumstance with specific training, particular physiological circumstances, and certain documented exceptional cases, all demonstrating meaningfully extended tolerance compared to this typical general pattern. Let's talk about the important distinction between complete oxygen deprivation and partial oxygen reduction too, because this represents an important terminological and physiological distinction worth clarifying directly before continuing this discussion further. Medical researchers generally distinguish between hypoxia, meaning reduced oxygen availability, and anoxia, meaning complete oxygen absence, since these two related but distinct conditions produce meaningfully different physiological effects and timelines. The rapid, urgent timeline already discussed extensively throughout this topic applies most directly to complete anoxia specifically, while various forms of partial hypoxia, reduced but not completely absent oxygen availability, can potentially be tolerated for meaningfully longer periods, depending on the specific severity of the reduction involved, illustrating why precise, careful terminology matters considerably when discussing this particular medical and physiological topic accurately. Let's talk about how various diving and hibernating animal species manage oxygen deprivation far more effectively than humans too, because this represents a truly interesting comparative biological perspective worth exploring specifically. Various marine mammals, including certain whale and seal species, have evolved remarkable physiological adaptations allowing them to hold their breath for extended periods, sometimes exceeding an hour or more, through a combination of specialized oxygen storage in their muscle tissue, dramatically reduced heart rate during diving, and specific blood flow redirection prioritizing critical organs during extended submersion. Similarly, certain hibernating mammal species demonstrate remarkable tolerance for significantly reduced oxygen availability during their hibernation period, connected to dramatically reduced overall metabolic rate during this specific biological state. These comparative examples are worth including because they illustrate that humans' relatively limited oxygen deprivation tolerance isn't some kind of fixed universal mammalian biological constant, but rather reflects our own species' particular evolutionary history and typical environmental circumstances, considerably different from the specific evolutionary pressures that shaped these other, more oxygen deprivation tolerant species' own particular physiological adaptations. Let's talk about therapeutic hypothermia as a specific medical technique directly informed by this underlying physiology too, because this represents an important, practically significant medical application worth exploring in additional depth. Medical researchers have developed specific therapeutic protocols involving deliberately, carefully lowering a patient's body temperature following certain medical emergencies involving oxygen deprivation, including cardiac arrest specifically, directly applying the same underlying physiological principle already discussed regarding cold water immersion cases. Since reduced body temperature meaningfully reduces cellular metabolic demand and, correspondingly, oxygen requirement throughout the body. This medical technique has demonstrated measurable success in improving patient outcomes and reducing permanent brain damage following certain oxygen deprivation emergencies. representing a compelling, direct, practical application of the underlying physiological principles already discussed extensively throughout this topic, translated directly into genuine, life-saving clinical medical practice. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about the specific physiological warning signs the body produces during oxygen deprivation too, because this represents an important, practically relevant detail worth exploring specifically. Before losing consciousness, a person experiencing oxygen deprivation typically experiences several specific warning symptoms, including an urgent, increasingly uncomfortable sensation of breathlessness, along with visual disturbances and confusion, as the brain's oxygen sensing mechanisms trigger increasingly urgent physiological alarm signals specifically designed to prompt immediate corrective action. This detail is worth including because it illustrates the body's own built-in warning system, a sophisticated, evolutionarily developed mechanism specifically designed to prompt urgent corrective behavior well before the more severe physiological consequences already discussed extensively throughout this topic actually begin occurring. Let's talk about carbon monoxide poisoning as a particularly dangerous indirect form of oxygen deprivation too, because this represents an important, medically significant variation worth exploring specifically before wrapping up this broader discussion. Carbon monoxide specifically interferes with the blood's normal capacity to transport oxygen effectively, binding to the same specific blood component oxygen normally uses for transport throughout the body, but with considerably greater chemical binding strength, effectively displacing oxygen and preventing its normal transport and delivery throughout the body, even when the surrounding air itself actually contains completely normal, adequate oxygen levels. This particular danger is worth including specifically because it represents an especially insidious form of effective oxygen deprivation, since a person experiencing carbon monoxide poisoning may not experience the same urgent breathlessness, warning signals already discussed extensively throughout this topic. Given that the fundamental problem involves blood oxygen transport specifically, rather than any actual shortage of available oxygen within the surrounding air itself, making this particular danger considerably harder to consciously notice and respond to compared to more straightforward oxygen deprivation scenarios already discussed throughout the rest of this topic. Let's talk about altitude and reduced oxygen availability specifically too, because this represents a different, related category worth exploring specifically, distinct from complete oxygen deprivation already discussed extensively throughout the rest of this topic. At high altitude, reduced atmospheric pressure means each individual breath contains meaningfully less available oxygen compared to sea level, requiring the body to adapt through various physiological mechanisms, including increased breathing rate and, over an extended period of high-altitude exposure, increased red blood cell production specifically to help compensate for this reduced oxygen availability. This represents a considerably different physiological challenge compared to complete, sudden oxygen deprivation already discussed extensively throughout this topic, since the body has meaningfully more time and opportunity to gradually adapt to reduced but still meaningfully present oxygen availability, rather than facing the sudden, complete absence of oxygen that creates the much more urgent, immediate crisis already discussed at length regarding complete oxygen deprivation specifically. Let's talk about how medical researchers actually study oxygen deprivation and its physiological effects too, because this represents an important methodological consideration worth addressing directly. Researchers studying this topic rely on a combination of carefully controlled laboratory research involving animal models, detailed clinical observation and treatment of actual real-world oxygen deprivation cases, including drowning and cardiac arrest patients, and careful physiological monitoring of trained breath-hold divers and other relevant populations already discussed extensively throughout this topic. This combination of research approaches has allowed medical researchers to develop an increasingly detailed, evidence-based understanding of exactly how oxygen deprivation affects the human body, directly informing emergency medical protocols specifically designed to maximize survival and minimize permanent damage during actual real-world oxygen deprivation emergencies. Let's talk about medical interventions specifically designed to extend survival during oxygen deprivation emergencies too, because this represents an important, practically relevant dimension worth exploring before wrapping up this broader discussion. Emergency medical techniques, including CPR and various other resuscitation protocols, work specifically by attempting to maintain at least some minimal blood circulation and oxygen delivery to critical organs, particularly the brain, during the crucial window before more complete emergency medical intervention becomes available, directly applying the underlying physiological understanding already discussed extensively throughout this topic toward practical, potentially life-saving emergency medical practice. Let's talk about how oxygen physiology differs meaningfully before birth, too, because this represents an interesting, often overlooked developmental detail worth exploring specifically before continuing this discussion further. Developing fetuses actually rely on a meaningfully different oxygen transport and utilization system compared to born infants and adults, receiving oxygen through the placenta rather than through independent breathing, and possessing a specific type of hemoglobin, the blood protein responsible for oxygen transport, particularly well suited to efficiently extracting oxygen under the relatively lower oxygen concentration environment characteristic of the womb specifically. This detail is worth including because it demonstrates that human oxygen physiology itself isn't entirely fixed and unchanging throughout an individual's entire life, but rather undergoes significant, well-documented developmental transitions specifically around the time of birth, when a newborn transitions from this specialized prenatal oxygen system toward the independent breathing and standard adult pattern oxygen transport system already discussed extensively throughout the rest of this topic. Let's talk about oxygen safety considerations in aviation and space exploration too, because this represents an important, practically significant applied context worth exploring specifically. Commercial aircraft and spacecraft both require careful, deliberate management of cabin oxygen levels and pressure, given how quickly the physiological consequences already discussed extensively throughout this topic could develop in the event of a sudden oxygen system failure or pressure loss at high altitude. This practical engineering challenge directly reflects the same fundamental physiological reality already explored throughout this entire discussion, requiring aviation and aerospace engineers to design robust, carefully redundant oxygen and pressure systems specifically because the underlying human physiological tolerance for oxygen deprivation remains so narrow and unforgiving. Particularly relevant given how quickly reduced atmospheric pressure at high altitude can otherwise produce dangerous oxygen deprivation even when the surrounding air's actual oxygen percentage composition technically remains unchanged. Let's talk about specific historical medical research that helped establish our current understanding of this topic too, because this represents an important, historically grounded methodological detail worth exploring before wrapping up this discussion. Much of the detailed, precise timeline understanding already discussed extensively throughout this topic, developed gradually through careful clinical research and observation across many decades of accumulated medical practice and research, including detailed study of resuscitation outcomes following cardiac arrest and drowning incidents, allowing medical researchers to progressively refine and improve understanding of exactly how quickly specific physiological consequences develop, and correspondingly, exactly how emergency medical intervention could most effectively address this seriously urgent physiological crisis before irreversible damage has the opportunity to actually occur. Let's talk about ongoing research continuing to refine understanding of this topic even today, too, because it's worth acknowledging honestly, before concluding this discussion, that meaningful active research continues in this specific area. Researchers continue actively investigating potential new medical interventions specifically designed to extend the currently understood survival window during oxygen deprivation emergencies, along with continuing to refine understanding of individual variation in oxygen deprivation tolerance, given how the specific documented exceptions and variations already discussed extensively throughout this topic suggest meaningful, still incompletely understood variation exists across different individuals and circumstances, representing a seriously active, ongoing area of medical research rather than a topic where current scientific understanding has already reached some kind of complete, final, fully settled conclusion. Let's talk briefly about how regular exercise and physical conditioning affect oxygen deprivation tolerance too, because this represents a practically relevant, relatable detail worth including before this discussion concludes. Research on trained athletes has found that regular cardiovascular exercise produces measurable improvements in the body's overall oxygen delivery and utilization efficiency, along with modest improvements in tolerance for brief periods of reduced oxygen availability during intense physical exertion specifically, though this represents a considerably more modest effect compared to the specialized breath hold training and unique physiological circumstances already discussed extensively throughout this topic. This detail is worth including because it demonstrates that while the fundamental biological timeline governing oxygen deprivation remains fairly consistent across most ordinary circumstances, general physical fitness still meaningfully influences the body's overall efficiency in managing and utilizing available oxygen, offering one more practically relevant, directly accessible way. Ordinary people can meaningfully influence their own body's oxygen-related physiological performance, even without pursuing the kind of specialized extreme training already discussed regarding elite breath hold divers specifically. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full, honest answer to whether humans can survive without oxygen turns out to depend considerably on the exact specific circumstances involved, rather than representing a single, simple, universally fixed answer. Under ordinary circumstances, complete oxygen deprivation becomes dangerous within roughly 1 to 2 minutes and potentially fatal within 4 to 6 minutes, reflecting the brain's unusually high oxygen requirement and extremely limited capacity for generating energy without it. However, specific circumstances, including cold water immersion and extensive specific breath hold training, can meaningfully extend this typical survival window, demonstrating that this general timeline, while medically well established as a typical pattern, isn't some kind of completely fixed universal biological constant applying identically under every possible circumstance and condition. So the next time you take an ordinary breath without giving it a second thought, it's worth appreciating just how remarkably fast your body's oxygen reserves would actually run out without that continuous automatic process, and correspondingly just how much sophisticated biological machinery is quietly working behind the scenes every single moment specifically to prevent that truly urgent physiological crisis from ever actually occurring under ordinary daily circumstances. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something as completely automatic and unconscious as breathing actually turns out to be protecting against such a remarkably fast, seriously urgent physiological crisis, what does that suggest about how many other completely automatic, unconscious bodily processes might be quietly, continuously protecting you from similarly serious, similarly fast-developing biological emergencies, entirely without your own conscious awareness or appreciation of the sophisticated biological work actually happening beneath the surface of your ordinary, unremarkable daily experience?